The photograph is small, no larger than the palm of a hand, the kind you'd expect to find in a shoebox under a bed, bent edges, fading ink, the smell of old paper, clinging like a secret. It shows a kindergarten classroom in black and white, lit by a sun that appears too sharp for winter, too soft for summer. The image seems ordinary at first glance, a chalkboard, a row of desks, scattered crayons rolling toward the floor, but then your eyes linger. Every chair is empty, not pushed back as though the children had run outside for recess, not neatly tucked in as if they'd been dismissed, just left in place, mid-use. Some have jackets draped over them. One has a small paper crown, the kind made for birthdays, sliding off the seat, as though it had been on a moving head. Only seconds before the shutter clicked on the far desk, a carton of milk still glistens, beads of condensation catching the light. Beside it, a sandwich cut into neat halves, untouched, the bread drying at the edges. If you look long enough, you begin to notice the dust in the air, frozen mid-fall, as if time had paused when the photograph was taken. It gives the entire room the strange stillness of an underwater scene where movement is possible, but simply absent. No one knows who took the photograph. It wasn't part of any official record, wasn't developed until decades later when it appeared in a shoebox at a yard sale 2 towns over. The seller had no memory of where it came from, only that it had been in a stack of old family photos, none of which contained this particular room. Local historians recognized the space instantly. Maplewood Kindergarten, circa 1963, the small school that once stood on the corner of Willow and 8th Street before it was shuttered in the mid-70s. The photograph is dated August 14, 1963, written in neat blue pen on the back. That was the last day anyone saw the children from that class or the substitute teacher who had been assigned to them for the week. The image has been passed between investigators, journalists, and collectors of the bizarre. Some claim the longer you stare at it, the more you notice tiny details that weren't there before. A dark shape in the far corner of the room, barely discernible, a smudge on the window that looks like a hand pressed against the glass from the outside. No official statement has ever explained where the photo came from or why it exists at all, because hay erased the thing by the time the police entered that room at 11:23 a.m. on that day. The light had shifted, the air smelled faintly of something burnt, and every trace of the children, their teacher, and their work had been erased. There should have been nothing left to photograph. In 1963, Maplewood wasn't the kind of town where things happened, at least not the kind of things people tell stories about. It was a place where the day began with the sound of milk bottles clinking on porches, where the biggest concern was whether the Saturday matinee at the cinema would be a cowboy picture or a romance. The air carried the scent of cut grass and baking bread, and neighbors would call to each other across white picket fences. Without hesitation or suspicion, the kindergarten sat at the heart of the neighborhood, a squat red brick building with cheerful blue shutters. The playground was no bigger than a small yard, its swing set painted lemon yellow, its slide a sun-faded red that burned the backs of children's legs. In August, on school days, parents lingered on the sidewalk long after drop-off, chatting in clusters, while their children's laughter drifted out of the open windows. The principal, George Merriman, was a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scent of pipe tobacco who believed education should be a safe place for small souls. He greeted every child by name and every parent with a handshake. There were only 2 classes for kindergarten-aged children in Maplewood that year. One was led by Mrs. Carson, a silver-haired woman with an iron spine and a heart that melted for her students. The other was scheduled to be taught by Mrs. Yates, but her sudden illness had prompted the school board to hire a substitute for the week, a young woman named Ms. Lorraine Halloway. Back then, no one thought much of it. Substitutes came and went, and Lorraine seemed, at least at first glance, to fit right in. Yet there were shadows, even in Maplewood's brightest days. In the weeks leading up to August 14th, a few parents reported odd incidents, small enough to dismiss, but strange enough to recall later. Mrs. Fisher, whose daughter Lily was in Lorraine's class, received 3 phone calls at dinner time, in which no one spoke on the other end. Only the sound of what she swore was children singing softly. The grocer's wife told her sister she had seen a man loitering across from the school one morning, sketching something in a notebook. When she crossed the street to take a look, he shut the book and walked away without a word. The most unsettling came to the principal himself. 2 envelopes delivered by hand with no return address, each containing a single sheet of paper. No words, just a child's drawing crude stick figures holding hands standing under a strange spiral in the sky. Merriman didn't tell the other staff about the drawings, not at the time. He didn't want to cause a stir. Looking back, people would say Maplewood had been too quiet for too long, that the kind of peace they'd been living in had been brittle all along, and no one noticed until the first hairline cracks began to form. August 14th was a Wednesday, a day meant for finger-painting milk break at 10:30, and a story about a rabbit who found its way home, but by noon, the rabbit's story would remain unfinished, and Maplewood would never again be the same. Lorraine Holloway arrived in Maplewood on a Monday morning 2 days before the disappearance. She was not the kind of woman one easily forgot, yet for all her striking features, there was something oddly indistinct about her, the kind of face you couldn't quite picture once she had stepped away. She was in her late 20s, tall and slender, with hair the color of honey left in the sun. Her eyes, gray, almost silver, seemed to fix on people without actually settling on them more than one parent would later describe, feeling as though she was looking past them or just slightly through them, as though they were a reflection in glass rather than a living person. Her voice was soft, deliberate, each word chosen with the care of someone for whom speaking was never careless. When she smiled, it was warm but brief, as though she was pulling the expression from somewhere far away. That Tuesday evening, Mrs. Carson invited her to have tea in the teacher's lounge. She recalled Lorraine being polite but asking strange questions. Do you find the light in this room different after 3 o'clock? Have you ever noticed the children drawing things they've never been shown? Mrs. Carson laughed them off, but she remembered later that Lorraine hardly touched her tea and kept glancing toward the hallway windows. The morning of the 14th, it was hot for August, the kind of heat that settles into your skin before the day is properly begun. Lorraine arrived precisely at 8:02, her dress pale blue with a thin white belt. She unlocked the classroom, opened the blinds halfway, and set out crayons in small cups at each desk. The first child arrived at 8:15, Timothy Warren, carrying a lunch pail with a rocket ship sticker peeling at the edges. By 8:45, the room was full of chatter and rustling paper. The morning passed without incident. The children drew houses and animals. Some asked to go outside early for recess, but Lorraine kept them indoors, claiming it was too bright today. At 10:30, milk break, a parent volunteer delivered the cartons, noting that Lorraine thanked her with a slight bow of the head, an oddly formal gesture. At 10:52, the classroom phone rang. It was mounted on the wall beside the door, the kind with a coiled cord and a rotary dial. No one remembers hearing it ring more than once or twice in all their years at the school. Lorraine stepped into the hallway to answer. The parent volunteer was still tidying cups when she noticed Lorraine's tone change from calm to something else, a sharpness, as though she were responding to instructions. She didn't hear the words, only a pause. Then Lorraine sang softly, "Yes, I understand." She returned to the classroom without a trace of alarm on her face, but she locked the door behind her. The last recorded sound, the janitor, Henry Clark, had been repairing a loose doorknob down the hall. He often carried a small tape recorder to listen back to his own notes about repairs. That morning, the device was still running as he passed the kindergarten door at 11:17 a.m. On the tape, you can hear the sound of children's laughter, high, ringing, genuine, then very faintly Lorraine's voice. "All right, everyone, it's time." 7 minutes later, the laughter was gone. The clock above the chalkboard read 11:16 a.m. From that moment forward, the timeline was reconstructed from scraps, eyewitness fragments, half-forgotten glances, and one stubborn old janitor's tape recorder. 11:17 a.m. The delivery truck pulled into the gravel lot behind the school. Driver Earl Dixon stepped out carrying a crate of fresh paper rolls for the office machines. He noticed the kindergarten door, the one that opened directly to the outside, was shut. The curtains inside were half-drawn, fluttering slightly in the breeze from a fan through the small gap. He thought he saw a movement, a row of children facing the far wall. They weren't playing, they weren't sitting, just standing. He shrugged it off. Maybe a game. 11:19 a.m. In the hallway, Mrs. Carson was returning from the supply closet. When she passed the kindergarten, she lifted a hand to wave at Lorraine through the glass. Lorraine did not wave back. Instead, she reached up and pulled the blinds completely closed. Mrs. Carson thought she saw her mouth form a single word, too quick to read, before the slats snapped shut. 11:20 a.m. Principal Merriman was in his office preparing notes for a meeting. He heard a sound, then faint but strange, like wind through a bottle or an electrical hum deep in the walls. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, and then nothing. Later, he would say it was the first moment his stomach tightened, the kind of instinct you don't argue with but can't quite explain. 11:21 a.m. The cafeteria smelled of chicken soup and fresh rolls, a lunch aid. Joan Miller was carrying a tray of utensils when the lights above her flickered just once. She looked up in surprise And when her eyes came back down, she thought she heard laughter echoing faintly from the kindergarten, but it was distant, muffled, almost as if coming from under the floor. 11:22 a.m. A faint scent began to drift into the corridor, something sharp and metallic, with an undertone of ozone like the air, just before a lightning strike. At that exact minute, Henry Clark's tape recorder clicks. Faintly, the laughter stops, and a low static hisses in the background. 11:23 a.m. Principal Merriman, uneasy now, left his office and walked toward the kindergarten. He knocked once, no answer. He knocked again, louder. The smell was stronger now, pricking at his nose. He reached for the handle, locked, frowning. He took out his master key. When the door swung open, a shaft of sunlight spilled across an empty room, empty chairs, crayons rolling lazily. On the floor, a paper crown lying crumpled in the corner. The fan still turned slowly, pushing air into a space that suddenly felt far too large. There was no sound, not even the hum of the lights, no teacher, no children. It was as though the room had exhaled, and everything living had gone with its breath. The first moments after the discovery were not loud, they were stunned. Principal Merriman stood in the doorway, one hand still on the knob, his eyes moving over the room, as though there must be some trick of perspective, a blind spot, a corner he wasn't seeing. He called out once, his voice cracking mid-word. No answer. By 11:25, he was in the hall, his heavy shoes echoing on the linoleum. As he shouted for Mrs. Carson, she came running, took one look inside the room, and froze. Later, she said she knew. Immediately, it wasn't like they'd just gone somewhere, it was like they'd never been there at all. 11:30 a.m., the alarm spreads. The front office phoned every classroom, telling teachers to keep their students inside. The school secretary dialed the sheriff's office, her hand trembling so badly she had to redial twice. By 11:38, the first sheriff's deputy, Tom Larkin, arrived. He entered the room, stood there for several long seconds, then quietly asked, "Where's the mess?" Because there was none. No overturned chairs, no scattered papers, not the kind of disarray you'd expect from 24 children leaving in a hurry. The absence was too neat. The parents arrive at 11:47. The first parent came running, Mrs. Fisher, whose daughter Lily had been in the class. She didn't wait for explanations. She just pushed past the deputies and began calling her daughter's name over and over, her voice rising with each unanswered cry. By noon, the front lawn of the school was a knot of people, mothers clutching photographs, fathers with set jaws, younger siblings clinging to legs. Some parents tried to rush into the building only to be held back by deputies shouting orders. No one wanted to hear the sound. It was a mixture of shouting, sobbing, and that awful silence from inside the classroom, the silence that seemed to bleed into the hallway no matter how many people filled it. The search begins. Sheriffs, deputies, local police, and eventually volunteers combed every inch of the school. Closets, bathrooms, crawl spaces. They lifted ceiling tiles, checked the roof, opened every locker. By 1:15 p.m., search teams moved outside, sweeping the playground, the field beyond, and the tree line that bordered the neighborhood. A group of fathers waded into Maplewood Pond, their pant legs soaked to the knees, dragging rakes through the muddy bottom in grim determination. Nothing, no footprints leading away from the building, no tire marks that shouldn't have been there, no sign that anyone had left the property at all. The first unsettling details, while deputies took statements, small inconsistencies began to emerge. The attendance sheet for that morning was missing from the teacher's desk. When asked, the school secretary insisted she'd delivered it. As usual, at 9:00 a.m., the blackboard, which according to the parent volunteer had been covered in children's drawings only an hour earlier, was wiped completely clean, not erased. In a hurry, washed, the faint scent of chalk dust replaced by the smell of damp cloth. And in the far corner of the room where the sunlight no longer reached, the janitor found a faint scorch mark on the floor, no larger than a dinner plate, its edges feathered like the remains of something burned at impossible heat. Nightfall. By evening, the search extended into the surrounding woods. Flashlights swept through the darkness. Dogs barked and pulled at their leads. Voices called out names into the wind. Inside the school, the parents stayed, refusing to leave, even when urged by officers. Some sat in the hallway, rocking silently. Others stood at the classroom door, staring inside as though willing their children to simply reappear. At midnight, the sheriff called off the official search. Until morning, no one slept. The first week after the disappearance was a blur of interviews, searches, and restless nights. Deputies went door to door, neighbors checked their sheds and attics. The local diner stayed open 24 hours, serving coffee to exhausted searchers and sleepless parents. For a brief moment, the town was unified by a single purpose: bring the children home. But unity doesn't last when there are no answers. Shifting memories, 7 days in the first cracks appeared in the timeline, and they came from the witnesses themselves. The janitor, Henry Clark, had been certain he heard children's laughter outside the classroom right before the disappearance. Now he insisted the sound had been muffled, as if it came from somewhere below him. The cafeteria worker Joan Miller swore she'd seen the children being led toward the gym at around 11:15 a.m., but the gym had been locked all morning, and the only key was accounted for when pressed. She admitted she might have remembered it wrong. And then there was Mrs. Carson, the other kindergarten teacher. In her first statement, she said she'd seen Lorraine pull the blinds shut, but a week later she told a reporter she could no longer remember if it was Lorraine's hand she saw or someone else's entirely. Fear turns inward. As memories shifted, so did the mood of the town. People began whispering about each other, about the neighbor who kept to himself, about the father who always seemed too calm, about the principal who didn't call the police quickly enough at night. Lights stayed on in houses that had always gone dark by 10. Locks were checked twice, 3 times. Children still in school were no longer allowed to walk anywhere without an adult. Even the air in Maplewood felt different, heavier, as though the silence from that empty classroom had seeped into the streets. The spiral drawings on the 8th day, a new detail surfaced. One of the deputies, while going through files in the principal's office, found 2 envelopes hidden at the back of a desk drawer, inside each a sheet of paper with a child's crude drawing, stick figures holding hands under a black spiral in the sky. Principal Merriman admitted had received them weeks before the disappearance. He said he hadn't reported them because they seemed like nothing, perhaps the work of a bored student. But when the drawings were shown to Mrs. Fisher, she paled. She claimed her daughter Lily had drawn something almost identical 2 nights before she vanished, except in Lily's drawing the spiral wasn't black, it was silver. The first rumors, the talk began quietly in hushed tones at the grocery store, at the back tables of the diner. Some said the children had been taken underground into tunnels no one knew existed. Others believed Lorraine had been part of something bigger, that she wasn't a teacher at all, but a lure. And a few, the ones who spoke least and watched most, whispered that maybe the children hadn't been taken out of Maplewood at all. Maybe they'd been taken somewhere else entirely. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the focus shifted from who might have taken the children to where they might have gone, and the where kept circling back to the same place, room 2B, Lorraine Holloway's classroom. The first signs: 2 weeks after the disappearance, Mrs. Carson returned to the room to collect some of the children's belongings for their families. She lasted less than 5 minutes inside. Later, she described it as a strange slowing, as though her thoughts were moving through syrup. She'd gone in to grab a sweater from a hook and found herself staring at the wall, unable to remember why she was there. When she stepped back into the hallway, it was as if a weight lifted instantly. She never went back inside. The investigators' deputies noticed things too. A flashlight's beam seemed weaker in the room than in the hall. Film taken with a police camera came back blank. Not overexposed, not underexposed, just empty. Sheriff's Deputy Tom Larkin swore he heard a faint melody when he stood near the chalkboard. Not music exactly, but the sing-song rhythm of children reciting something together. When he asked others if they heard it, they looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Journalists and ghost hunters. By the 3rd week, the disappearance had drawn national attention. Reporters arrived from Chicago, New York, even Los Angeles. Some came with cameras, others with tape recorders. One Chicago journalist, Harriet Cole, stepped into room 2B and lasted a full 20 minutes. She left pale, her voice shaking, and refused to say what had happened. She told her editor she would not be returning to Maplewood ever. Years later, in a rare interview, Harriet would admit she'd heard breathing in the empty classroom slow, deep, as though the room itself were inhaling the mother in the night. The most chilling account came from a grieving mother, Evelyn Hart, who had lost her son Daniel in the disappearance. One rainy night, she slipped into the school through an unlocked side door. She walked down the dark hallways barefoot, carrying nothing but a flashlight. When she reached room 2B, she swore she heard her son's voice from inside, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. She called to him, no answer. She opened the closet door at the back of the room and stood there in the dark. The voice was closer now, but she couldn't see anything. She stepped forward 1 foot, then another, until her flashlight flickered and went out. When it came back on, she was standing in the hallway, facing the wrong direction. She didn't remember walking out. By the end of the month, the school board voted to seal room 2B permanently. The door was locked, the windows boarded over, and no one was allowed inside without written permission from the sheriff's office. Still, people claimed to hear things when they walked past, faint singing, a knock from inside the scent of ozone room 2 B had stopped being a classroom, it had become something else. If the classroom was the where Lorraine Holloway was the who, but finding out who she was proved almost impossible. The paper trail that wasn't. Deputies began by contacting the agency that had sent her to Maplewood as a substitute. The address on her file led to an empty storefront, its windows dusty, and its sign long faded. Her resume listed previous teaching work in 3 different towns, none of which had any record of her. No tax documents, no pay stubs, no union membership. There was no birth certificate under her name in the state registry, no driver's license, no known relatives. It was as though she had stepped into the world fully formed, stayed just long enough to teach for a week, and then vanished along with her students. The landlady's story: she had been renting a room above the old post office from Mrs. Clara Whitcomb, a widow in her 60s. Clara remembered Lorraine as quiet and polite, paying rent in cash at the start of the week. She never cooked in the shared kitchen, though she often came in late at night to boil water for tea. Clara recalled that Lorraine always sat at the small table facing east toward the sunrise, even when it was hours before dawn. One night Clara awoke to find Lorraine standing in the hallway, motionless, staring at the front door. When Clara asked if something was wrong, Lorraine simply said, "I'm listening for the change." Clara never asked what she meant. The library visits at the Maplewood Public Library. The head librarian, Margaret Wells, said Lorraine visited 3 times in her short stay. She checked out books on early childhood education, ordinary enough, but also 2 obscure volumes of European folklore, both dealing with legends of thresholds between places. Margaret remembered one in particular, a worn leather-bound book with a chapter titled The Spiral Gate. She had never seen anyone check it out before. The locked trunk. When deputies searched Lorraine's rented room after the disappearance, they found little: a single suitcase with neatly folded dresses, a comb, a toothbrush. In the corner sat a small wooden trunk. Locked inside were only 3 items: a hand-drawn map of Maplewood Kindergarten rendered in meticulous detail. Room 2B. It was circled in red, a black-and-white photograph of children in a playground, none of them identifiable, their faces oddly blurred. A torn page from a book depicting a crude spiral above a doorway with handwritten words in the margin: "When the sky hums, the door will open." The witness at the bus stop. The most unsettling lead came from a man named Peter Caldwell, who drove the early morning bus into town on the Monday before the disappearance. He claimed to have seen Lorraine standing alone at the bus stop long before sunrise. She was looking not down the road, but straight up at the sky. When he called out to her, she smiled faintly and said it will be soon. By the time investigators pieced together these fragments, Lorraine was already gone, and not just from Maplewood, from everywhere. There was no trace of her anywhere in the country. It was as if she had stepped through whatever door she had been listening for. It had been 20 years since the day Room 2B went silent. The town had aged around its absence. The school had closed in 1975, its bricks weathering to a dull brown, the playground rusted in the weeds. Parents who had once waited on the front lawn every night until the sheriff forced them home had grown older, grayer. Some had moved away, some had simply stopped speaking of it. Then in the spring of 1983, an envelope arrived at the Maplewood Police Department. The envelope, it was postmarked from a city 3 states away, no return address. The handwriting was uneven, as though from a trembling hand. In faded blue ink inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The letter began, "Without greeting, I am one of them. I was in the room." It went on to describe the place. "We went to a world too quiet, with the sky the wrong color. There were no buildings, no people, just a pale, endless plain under a spiraling sky that never moved. The air was heavy, the silence pressing against the ears until you forgot the sound of your own voice." The writer said they could not remember how long they were there. Time didn't feel the same, but they knew they were not alone. The other children were there, and so was Lorraine. The letter claim told them they would be safe here until it was time. The warning, the last lines of the letter, were the most disturbing. "I think the door is opening again. I can hear it. If you don't believe me, watch the sky. When it hums." It was signed not with a full name, but a child's nickname, Danny. The problem: Daniel Hart had been one of the missing. His mother, Evelyn, still lived in Maplewood. When the police showed her the letter, she wept and confirmed that Danny was what she had called her son, but handwriting experts couldn't verify its authenticity. The paper was ordinary, the postmark untraceable, the fingerprints smudged beyond use. And there was one final unexplainable detail: the bottom of the page smelled faintly, unmistakably, of ozone. By 2012, Maplewood's old kindergarten was little more than a shell. The red bricks had faded to rust. The playground equipment stood like skeletal metal bones, and vines crept through the cracks in the foundation. The school board had long debated tearing it down that summer, they finally approved the demolition. The first day of work on a cloudy August morning, a small crew arrived, 2 excavators, a dump truck, and 6 workers in hard hats. They began by removing the boarded windows and clearing the debris from the inside. When they reached the south hallway, the foreman stopped in front of room 2B's locked door. The wood was warped with age, the hinges streaked with rust. He told the men to break it down. The door gave way after 2 heavy swings of a sledgehammer inside the room. The air inside was wrong. Every worker described it differently later: colder, heavier, like walking into a basement after rain. Dust hung in the air, but it didn't drift down. It seemed to float, as if suspended on the far wall. The faded outline of desks could still be seen where sunlight had bleached the floor, and faintly, so faintly one had to squint, a row of small handprints marked the wall beneath the window. The sky changes. Around 11:20 that morning, one of the workers, Miguel Santos, stepped outside to get a tool from the truck. He froze. The daylight had changed. The sky above the school had gone pale, not cloud gray, but a strange flat silver, as though the color had been drained out of it. At the same moment, the others inside room 2B heard something, a low, resonant hum, not coming from any machine, but from everywhere at once. The dust in the air seemed to shiver. The figures. Miguel swore that through the window of room 2B, he saw a group of children. They stood in 2 neat rows, wearing clothes decades out of fashion, knee socks, pinafores, pressed shirts. None of them moved, none of them blinked. In the center stood a tall woman in a pale blue dress, her hair pinned neatly back. Miguel had never seen a photograph of Lorraine Holloway, but when shown one later, he turned white and refused to speak. Aftermath. The workers abandoned the site within the hour. The school board quietly canceled the demolition, citing structural hazards. Since then, room 2B has remained untouched. The door is sealed again, not with boards this time, but with a steel plate bolted directly into the frame. Still, locals say that on certain summer mornings, just before noon, the light over the school shifts to that same unnatural silver, and if you stand close enough, you can feel the faintest vibration in the air. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of tragedy, except in Maplewood. Here, the wound never closed. A town that stayed behind. Some parents left in the years after 1963, unable to walk the same streets without imagining their children turning the corner at any moment. Others stayed, rooted by grief, as if leaving would mean giving up the search forever. Photographs of the missing still hang in kitchen corners, their colors faded to sepia. Birthdays are quietly marked with candles lit in empty chairs. The few surviving classmates from the other kindergarten class, now grown with children and even grandchildren of their own, rarely speak of that day, but when they do, their voices carry the weight of a memory too heavy for its age. The 2 stories ask around Maplewood today, and you'll hear 2 stories. One says the disappearance was a crime, elaborate, well-planned, and still unsolved. Lorraine was either a conspirator or a victim, and the children are buried somewhere no one's ever looked. The other says room 2B was as a thin place, a doorway between worlds that happened to open at the wrong time, swallowing everything inside. In this version, the children are still out there somewhere, maybe unchanged, maybe waiting for the rest of us to catch up. The classroom today, the school building, is fenced off, its windows sealed, but every so often someone slips through: a photographer, a thrill seeker, a teenager looking for proof of the local legend. Those who come back say the same thing. The air in the south hallway feels different, not colder exactly, but heavier, like being underwater, and if you press your ear to the steel plate over room 2B's door, you can hear something, a hum, a breath, or the faint sound of children laughing carried from somewhere too far to measure. A mirror of the beginning. In the town archives, the mysterious black and white photograph of the empty classroom is still kept in a plastic sleeve, but a second photograph surfaced in 2018. This one was in color, taken through a narrow crack between the boards that had once covered room 2B's window. It shows the same room lit by the same thin beam of sunlight, but if you look at the far wall, you'll see faint silhouettes, small child's eyes cast in the dust. They're facing the door, as though waiting, and in the very center of them, a taller shadow stands, hands folded, head slightly tilted. For years, the janitor's tape recorder sat in an evidence box buried under reports and photographs in the Maplewood Police Archives. The device itself was small, battered, its buttons stiff from disuse. Most assumed the tape inside had already been reviewed back in 1963. It hadn't. The restoration in 2019, during a digitization project, an audio specialist named Hannah Reeves found the recorder in a sealed envelope marked simply from Clark, August 14th. 1963. The tape inside was fragile, its magnetic coating flaking at the edges. Hannah worked for weeks to restore what she could, stitching the fragments into a single playable file. When she pressed play for the first time, she expected the familiar static of degraded audio. She got that. But underneath something else, the recording. It begins with the faint clatter of a toolbox, Henry Clark's, and the sound of his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Then in the background, the unmistakable laughter of children. It's light, genuine, the sound of a morning in full swing. After about 6 seconds, the laughter begins to fade, not suddenly, but as if moving farther away, even though the recorder is stationary. Then a voice, soft, calm, female. It's time now. There's no urgency in it, no fear, just a kind of gentle finality, as though announcing the end of recess. A few beats of silence. And then faintly, so faintly you might miss it if you're not listening for it, another sound, a low, resonant hum like the one described in the letter from 1983, the one the workers claimed to hear in 2012. The hum grows louder for 3 seconds, then cuts off abruptly. The rest of the tape is blank. The unanswered question. When Hannah Reeves sent the digitized file to the Maplewood Historical Society, she included a note at the bottom of her email. If this really was 11:17 a.m. on August 14th, 1963, where exactly did that voice go after she said those words? No one ever answered. And somewhere in a locked metal cabinet in the Society's archives, the audio file still sits ready to play for anyone who dares to hear it.